There's a moment that terrifies a narcissist more than betrayal, more than confrontation, more than being caught in an obvious lie. It's the moment they say something designed to wound, designed to provoke, designed to trigger the familiar scramble for approval they've come to expect, and instead of scrambling, the person just looks at them. Not with hatred, not with defiance even, just with a kind of quiet, unreadable calm that says, without a single word, I don't need you to think well of me anymore. That moment, small as it looks from the outside, is one of the most powerful shifts that can happen inside a relationship, and almost nobody talks about why it carries so much weight. We tend to think of power in relationships as something loud, winning an argument, getting the last word, making someone finally admit they were wrong. But the real power in these dynamics, the kind that actually changes the balance of a relationship at its foundation, is almost always quiet, and it almost always comes down to the same thing: a person no longer needing another person's approval to feel steady in who they are. This is what we're exploring today, and by the end, you'll understand why this specific shift, more than any argument won or any boundary announced, is the single most disruptive thing an empath can do inside a relationship with a narcissist, whether or not they ever intended as a strategy at all. Let's start by understanding what approval seeking actually looks like inside these relationships, because it's rarely as obvious as constantly asking, "Are you mad at me?" or "Did I do something wrong?" It's usually far more subtle than that, woven so deeply into daily interaction that most empaths don't even recognize it as approval seeking until much later, when they can finally see the pattern from a distance. It looks like softening an opinion before it's even been challenged, just in case it might cause friction. It looks like over-explaining a simple decision, adding extra justification nobody asked for, because some part of the empath has learned that unexplained choices tend to get questioned or criticized. It looks like scanning someone's face the moment you walk into a room, checking their mood before you've even said hello, adjusting your own energy to match whatever you find there before a single word has been exchanged. None of this looks dramatic in any single instance. That's exactly why it's so hard to recognize while it's happening. Approval seeking in these relationships isn't a single behavior. It's a constant, low-grade orientation, a kind of background operating system running underneath every interaction, quietly asking one question over and over: is this okay with them? And here's what makes this so exhausting, though most empaths don't realize how exhausting it is until it stops. This question never actually gets answered in a way that provides lasting relief. The approval, when it comes, is temporary. It has to be earned again in the very next interaction, because the underlying dynamic was never built to produce stable reassurance. It was built to produce ongoing dependency on a source of validation that intentionally, even if unconsciously, never stays satisfied for long. This is worth understanding clearly, because it explains something that confuses a lot of people trying to make sense of these relationships from the outside. Why an intelligent, capable, self-aware person would spend years chasing approval from someone who rarely gives it consistently and almost never gives it without conditions attached. The answer isn't a lack of self-worth in the way people usually imagine it. Most empaths caught in this pattern have plenty of self-worth in other areas of their lives: thriving careers, healthy friendships, clear boundaries with everyone except this one specific person. What's actually happening is something more precise. The narcissist has positioned themselves, often gradually, and without the empath fully realizing it, as the primary source of feedback about whether the empath's own instincts can be trusted. This positioning doesn't happen through obvious manipulation in most cases. It happens through a slow accumulation of small moments where the empath's perception gets subtly questioned, and the narcissist's version of events gets subtly prioritized. A concern gets raised, and instead of being addressed directly, it gets reframed as the empath being too sensitive or reading into things. A boundary gets stated, and instead of being respected, it gets met with just enough resistance, disappointment, or guilt that the empath starts second-guessing whether the boundary was reasonable in the first place. Over time, these small moments accumulate into something significant. The empath's internal compass, the one they use to trust instinctively, starts requiring external confirmation before they can act on it. And the narcissist, whether deliberately or not, becomes the primary source of that confirmation. This is the actual mechanism behind approval seeking in these relationships, and understanding it changes everything about how we should think about the moment an empath finally stops. Stopping isn't simply a change in behavior, it's a fundamental reclaiming of internal authority that had been slowly, quietly outsourced over months or years. And this is exactly why it disrupts the relationship so profoundly, far more than anger ever could, because anger, as we've discussed in other explorations of this dynamic, still operates within the existing structure. Anger says, "I need you to see this differently." Approval seeking's disappearance says something much more foundational. "I no longer need you to see anything about me at all in order to know what's true." Let's talk about how this shift actually begins, because it rarely starts as a conscious decision. Nobody wakes up one morning and decides, "Today I will stop seeking approval from this person." It usually starts much smaller than that, almost accidentally. Maybe it's a single instance where the empath says something honest, expecting the usual pushback, and instead of immediately backpedaling or over-explaining the way they always have, something in them just doesn't. They let the statement stand. They don't rush to soften it. And in that small, unremarkable moment, something shifts internally that the empath themselves might not even fully register until later. They notice that the sky didn't fall. The relationship didn't end. And more importantly, they notice that they survived the discomfort of not immediately smoothing things over, and that survival becomes evidence, quiet but undeniable, that the approval they've been chasing all this time was never actually necessary for their own stability in the first place. This single moment doesn't undo years of conditioning, and it would be dishonest to suggest it does. But it plants something important: proof, gained through direct experience rather than abstract reasoning, that the empath's sense of self can hold steady without the narcissist's validation propping it up. And once that proof exists, even in one small instance, it becomes much harder to fully return to the old pattern, because some part of the empath now knows something they didn't fully know before. This is often how the entire shift begins, not with a dramatic declaration of independence, but with one quiet moment of accidental steadiness that reveals a capacity the empath didn't realize they still had. What happens next, as this pattern of steadiness starts to repeat and compound, is where things get genuinely interesting, because the relationship itself starts to respond to this shift in ways that reveal, with striking clarity, exactly what the approval-seeking dynamic had actually been protecting all along. The narcissist doesn't simply adjust to this new version of the empath and move on. Something else happens instead, something that exposes, more clearly than almost anything else in this entire dynamic, just how much the relationship's stability had always depended on one person's willingness to keep asking for permission to trust themselves. And that's exactly where we need to go next, into what actually happens inside a narcissist when the person they've relied on for validation quietly stops offering it. Why this particular shift produces reactions so different from ordinary conflict, and what this reveals about the real, often uncomfortable truth of what approval seeking had been serving in this relationship the entire time. To understand what happens inside a narcissist when approval seeking quietly disappears, we need to look at something we've touched on before but haven't fully unpacked: the specific function that another person's need for validation serves in maintaining a narcissist's sense of authority within a relationship. It's not simply that being needed feels good, though it certainly does. It's that an empath's ongoing need for approval creates a built-in hierarchy, one where the narcissist occupies the position of judge, and the empath occupies the position of petitioner, constantly presenting their thoughts, feelings, and choices for evaluation. This hierarchy doesn't require the narcissist to do very much active work to maintain. It simply requires the empath to keep showing up and asking, in whatever subtle form that question takes, is this okay with you? When that question stops being asked, the hierarchy doesn't gently dissolve into something more equal. It collapses, often quite suddenly, and the narcissist has to confront something they've rarely had to face directly, functioning within a relationship where their evaluation of the other person's choices no longer carries the weight it once did. This is genuinely disorienting for someone whose sense of authority has been built brick by brick on the assumption that their opinion matters more than the other person's own instincts. And disorientation in narcissistic dynamics rarely produces calm acceptance. It tends to produce escalation, specifically designed, whether consciously or not, to restore the hierarchy that's just been threatened. This escalation often takes a specific and revealing shape worth naming clearly: intensified criticism aimed precisely at the areas where the empath has started showing the most independence. If the empath used to soften every opinion and has now started stating them plainly, criticism often increases around exactly those newly plain statements, accusations of being harsh, cold, difficult, not like you used to be. If the empath used to over-explain every decision and has now started simply making choices without justification, criticism often targets that exact shift. Questions about why they've become so secretive, so unwilling to communicate, so different from before. This pattern is worth understanding precisely because it reveals something important. The criticism isn't actually about the specific behavior being criticized. It's an attempt to make the newly steady behavior costly enough that the empath returns to the old pattern of seeking approval before acting. This is where something crucial needs to be said plainly, because it's easy to mistake this escalation for evidence that the empath is doing something wrong, especially when the accusations are delivered with real emotional intensity. The increased criticism isn't feedback about genuine problems in the empath's behavior. It's friction, applied specifically to the exact place where control has started slipping, in an attempt to restore the old dynamic through discomfort rather than genuine dialogue. Recognizing this distinction between feedback meant to improve a relationship and friction meant to restore control is one of the most important skills an empath can develop during this transition, because mistaking one for the other is exactly what pulls people back into old patterns just as they're beginning to break free of them. Let's talk about a subtler pattern that often accompanies this escalation, one that's rarely discussed with real clarity: the narcissist's growing tendency to seek external validation of their own perspective once the empath stops providing it internally. This might look like recruiting mutual friends or family members into disputes, presenting a version of events designed to win outside agreement that the empath has become difficult or changed for the worse. It might look like an increased need to be right in front of an audience, even about minor disagreements that would never have mattered enough to escalate publicly before. What's happening underneath this behavior is fairly direct once you understand the mechanism. The narcissist has lost their primary source of validating feedback, and rather than developing an internal source to replace it, they're searching for external sources to fill the gap that the empath used to occupy. This search often produces behavior that seems on the surface unrelated to the empath's own shift, but is actually a direct response to it. Sudden new friendships that seem to appear out of nowhere, often characterized by intense, quick-forming closeness. Sudden increased activity on social media seeking engagement and validation from a wider audience. Sudden interest in projects or pursuits specifically designed to generate admiration from people outside the relationship. None of this necessarily means anything sinister is happening, and it would be inaccurate to frame every instance of a narcissist seeking outside connection as evidence of bad intent. But it's worth understanding the underlying pattern. When one source of validation stops flowing as reliably as it once did, narcissistic psychology tends to seek replacement sources rather than developing genuine internal stability because internal stability was never the strategy being employed in the first place. Now let's turn to something equally important and far less discussed. What actually happens inside the empath during this period of pushback and escalation? Because this is where the real test of the shift takes place. It's one thing to have a single moment of accidental steadiness, as we discussed toward the end of part 1. It's another thing entirely to maintain that steadiness while facing intensified criticism, external recruitment, and all the other forms of friction a destabilized narcissist might apply in an attempt to restore the old dynamic. This period is genuinely difficult, and it's worth naming that difficulty honestly, because empaths going through this transition often assume something is wrong with them when the discomfort doesn't disappear immediately after they stop seeking approval. The discomfort isn't evidence of failure, it's evidence that a deeply conditioned pattern is being actively disrupted, and disruption of deep conditioning is uncomfortable by nature, regardless of how correct the underlying shift actually is. Here's what tends to happen for empaths who move through this discomfort successfully, rather than retreating back into old patterns of seeking approval to relieve the tension. They begin developing what might be called internal cross-referencing, a practice of checking their own perceptions against their own accumulated experience rather than against the narcissist's real-time reaction. Instead of asking, in the moment, does this seem okay to them? They start asking, does this align with what I've observed to be true and healthy over time, based on my own consistent experience? This is a genuinely different cognitive process, and it produces a genuinely different kind of confidence. Not the temporary, externally validated confidence that used to come from receiving approval, but a steadier, more durable confidence built on trusting patterns they themselves have witnessed and verified. This shift toward internal cross-referencing is, in many ways, the actual mechanism behind everything we've been calling hidden power throughout this exploration. It's hidden precisely because it doesn't look like power in any conventional sense. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't require winning arguments or delivering ultimatums. It simply operates quietly underneath the surface of every interaction, gradually replacing a system that required constant external confirmation with a system that generates its own stability from within. And this quiet internal shift turns out to be far more disruptive to a narcissistic dynamic than any dramatic confrontation could ever be, precisely because it can't be argued with, can't be criticized into submission, and doesn't require the narcissist's cooperation or agreement to keep functioning. This brings us to the final and most important part. Let's start with what actually changes once internal cross-referencing stops being an effortful practice and becomes something closer to a permanent operating system. This distinction matters enormously because the early stages of this shift, the ones we explored toward the end of part 2, still require conscious effort. The empath has to actively catch themselves reaching for approval, actively redirect toward their own accumulated experience, actively tolerate the discomfort of not receiving the reassurance they used to depend on. This is real work, and it's exhausting in its own way, even though it's a fundamentally healthier kind of exhaustion than the old pattern ever produced. But something happens after enough repetition, after enough instances of trusting their own read on a situation, and having that trust proven accurate over time. The effort starts to disappear. What was once a conscious correction becomes simply how the empath processes reality by default. This transition from effortful practice to default operating system is worth understanding precisely because it explains something that puzzles people watching an empath go through this transformation from the outside, why the change eventually stops looking like a struggle and starts looking almost unsettlingly like ease. Family members, friends, sometimes even the narcissist themselves, often comment on this shift with a kind of confused admiration or discomfort, depending on their relationship to the empath. There's no more visible tension in how the empath handles disagreement. There's no more visible bracing before delivering an honest opinion. What used to require enormous internal effort now happens smoothly, almost automatically, and this smoothness is precisely what makes it so disruptive to anyone who was counting on the old, effortful, approval-seeking version of this person to remain in place. Here's the deepest insight worth sitting with, the one that ties together everything we've explored across this entire story. What actually gets restored when approval seeking is genuinely replaced isn't just independence from one specific person's opinion. It's something more foundational than that. The empath's basic relationship with their own perception, the fundamental sense that their read on reality is valid without needing to be cross-checked against someone else's evaluation first. This might sound similar to something we've discussed before, but there's an important distinction here worth making explicit. Independence from a narcissist's approval is a specific situational achievement. Trust in one's own perception, once genuinely restored, becomes a permanent feature of how a person moves through every relationship they'll ever have, not just this particular difficult one. This is why the hidden power we've been circling throughout this entire exploration isn't really about power over the narcissist at all, even though it certainly disrupts the narcissist's influence as a natural side effect. The real power is internal, and it's worth naming this distinction clearly, because it changes what this entire journey actually means for the person going through it. An empath who stops seeking a narcissist's approval isn't primarily achieving victory in a battle of wills. They're recovering something that was always theirs to begin with, something that got quietly outsourced over months or years of small, cumulative moments where their own perception was subtly questioned until they stopped trusting it automatically. The power isn't newly created. It's simply no longer being given away. Let's talk about what this actually looks like in the texture of daily life, because it's worth making concrete rather than leaving it abstract. An empath who has genuinely completed this shift doesn't experience relationships, even difficult ones, as constant referendums on their own worth. A disagreement is simply a disagreement, information to be weighed and considered, not evidence requiring urgent repair before some internal alarm can be silenced. A cold or dismissive reaction from someone else doesn't trigger the old scramble to identify what went wrong and fix it immediately. It triggers curiosity instead, an observational stance that asks, what's actually happening here, rather than a reactive stance that asks, what do I need to do right now to make this okay again? This shift from reactive scrambling to observational curiosity might be the single clearest marker that internal cross-referencing has become permanent rather than situational. This changes something important about how the empath experiences criticism specifically, because criticism used to function as a kind of verdict, something requiring immediate emotional response and correction. Once internal validation is stable, criticism becomes something closer to raw data, information that can be genuinely useful when it comes from someone whose judgment has proven reliable over time, and information that can be simply noted and released when it comes from someone whose patterns have shown otherwise. This isn't defensiveness or an inability to hear feedback, which is sometimes how it gets mischaracterized by people uncomfortable with this new steadiness. It's actually the opposite, a more accurate, more discerning relationship with feedback, one that finally sorts input based on its actual reliability rather than accepting every piece of criticism with equal weight simply because it arrived with enough emotional force to demand attention. There's one more layer worth exploring here, because it's perhaps the most quietly significant of everything we've discussed across this entire journey. What happens to the empath's capacity for genuine connection once it's no longer entangled with approval seeking? This is worth addressing directly, because there's a common fear that accompanies this transformation, one that deserves honest acknowledgement rather than dismissal. Many empaths worry, somewhere in the middle of this process, that becoming less reliant on others' approval will make them colder, more distant, less capable of the deep connection that made them who they are in the first place. This fear is understandable, but it consistently turns out to be unfounded, and understanding why matters enormously for anyone currently in the middle of this difficult transition. Approval seeking was never actually the source of the empath's capacity for connection. It was a distortion of that capacity, a redirection of natural depth and attentiveness toward the specific narrow task of managing someone else's evaluation of them. Once that redirection stops, the underlying capacity doesn't disappear. It becomes available again for its original purpose. Genuine curiosity about other people, genuine care for their well-being, genuine presence in relationships that aren't structured around constant evaluation. This is why so many empaths who complete this transformation describe their relationships across the board as feeling deeper and more satisfying afterward, not shallower. The depth was never the problem. The problem was where all that depth had been forced to point toward managing someone else's judgment instead of actually connecting with who that person really was. This brings us to the final understanding this entire exploration has been building toward, the one worth carrying forward long after any single relationship, healthy or otherwise, has run its course. The hidden power of an empath who stops seeking a narcissist's approval was never really about defeating anyone, proving anything, or winning some quiet contest of wills. It was about something much simpler and much more permanent: the return of an internal authority that should have belonged to them the entire time, one that got quietly borrowed by someone who needed it more than they were willing to admit, and one that, once reclaimed, doesn't require anyone else's permission or agreement to remain intact.